Hello, my name is louisa.judge, and this is my presentation for my senior thesis in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department. My project is titled A Room of Their Own, Trauma-Informed Hospital Design for Sexual Assault Patients in St. Louis. And just a heads up, this presentation will cover topics of sexual assault and domestic violence. To begin, I ask that my audience imagines themselves entering a space like the emergency room of a hospital. There is excessive stimulation, constant noise, and harsh fluorescent lighting. This is not a pleasant environment for any person in medical need, much less a patient who has just experienced sexual violence. When discussing sexual violence and sexual trauma, it is important to understand what a trauma-informed approach looks like within a healthcare system. And I believe that it begins first with the understanding that any patient may have experienced trauma, either previously in their lifetime or recently. With that understanding, a hospital should strive to create a structural culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. And I believe that this culture of safety, empowerment, and healing can be enforced through the physical structure of the hospital as well, and the design and architecture of those spaces. And that belief led me to the question that really drove this project: how can hospital environments for sexual assault patients be better trauma-informed? And I will say sexual assault patients throughout this project, and by that I mean patients who are in the hospital explicitly to receive services and treatment because of a sexual assault. To begin, I would like to situate my project within the work that has come before it and give a brief overview of the literature review I conducted. And so when I began looking at sexual assault patients as a population and as a topic, I found that they really sat within the crossroads of a number of different fields, which included evidence-based design and healing design, which look at the environment as a component of a patient's healing, human-centered design, as well as patient-centered healthcare, designing spaces that are universally accessible, which grew from disability studies, as well as survivor-centered advocacy within anti-violence work, and trauma-informed care, which is a field that has developed throughout the past few decades. And while I felt like all of these fields shared common goals and ideologies, I found that these fields really were not in conversation as much as I had expected them to be. And the field that would really suit the population of sexual assault patients had barely any literature on it, and that was the field of trauma-informed hospital design. To continue to contextualize my project, I want to provide a bit of background on sexual assault patients within St. Louis hospitals. And an important organization within violence response in St. Louis is the YWCA, who coordinates the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Response Team and trains volunteers who provide support, information, and resources to rape victims in local hospital emergency departments. And this DV-SART includes not only those volunteer advocates, but also sexual assault nurse examiners and often detectives from the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. And this DV-SART team is typically activated by a triage nurse after a patient has disclosed that they have been assaulted. And the DV-SART process can encompass a physical exam for injuries, forensic evidence collection, a police interview and statement, as well as medication and emergency contraception. Once the triage nurse has activated this team, the patient is typically moved immediately to a private room. And this is significant to my project because it means that the spaces that a sexual assault patient occupies within a hospital are typically limited to the examination room and the hallways of the emergency department. And the hospitals that I looked at within this project are Barnes Jewish Hospital, SSM Health St. Mary's Hospital, SSM Health St. Louis University Hospital, and SSM Health DePaul Hospital. And all of these hospitals are either within St. Louis City or County. When I originally planned my project, I knew that I wanted to use methods that were interdisciplinary, immersive, feminist, and trauma-informed, which led to the following mixed methods approach. And the first component of this was participatory research, which involved my own training as a domestic violence and sexual assault response team volunteer advocate. And that entailed 50 hours of training with the YWCA and learning firsthand how the response to sexual assault patients looks and what spaces it includes. I also felt that I was able to meet the people whose insights were the most important within this process, and participating in this hands-on, up-close way, I felt really informed my interviews and made me much more equipped to study this topic. Next, I conducted individual and group interviews with DV-SART advocates, sexual assault nurse examiners, as well as hospital architects and planners. I asked these same participants to engage in design thinking exercises, which took a bit more of a creative and hands-on approach to research. And finally, throughout this entire project, I tried to do a comparative analysis of spaces, both the hospital spaces that I saw firsthand as a volunteer advocate, as well as the spaces that I heard about in my interviews. The participants within this project included 5 volunteer advocates from the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Response Team, 3 sexual assault nurse examiners, 2 hospital architects and designers based in St. Louis, and 1 director of hospital support services and public safety. And I think it's important to note that I did not have any prior sexual assault patients as participants in my project, and I do believe that that is a limitation. However, I felt that as an undergraduate researcher, I would not know how to interview these patients without potentially re-traumatizing them, and I did not want to risk my project doing more harm than good. I also hoped that by interviewing the volunteer advocates, I would be able to get a small insight into their experience, although, of course, it was not complete. Here are some of the questions that I would ask if I were interviewing either nurses or volunteer advocates about the spaces that they've worked in. And here are some of the questions that I would ask hospital architects and designers, as well as hospital planners. As I previously mentioned, I asked participants to engage in design thinking research, and one of those exercises was named the card sort exercise. And this involved me giving the participant a stack of cards that each listed a different factor of an examination room. So those included the lighting, the type of bed, wall art, the entrance to the room, the size of the room, storage, etc. And they also could write their own cards. And I asked them to order those factors in terms of significance. So what they felt was most important and would impact a patient and a staff the most, and what factors they found the least significant. And I asked 2 advocates to perform this exercise, as well as a hospital architect and a hospital planner. And it was really valuable to my research because it helped me understand how different professions view a space through different lenses, and how the lighting could be incredibly important to an advocate and feel less significant to a designer, and how that leads to incompatibility between spaces and their users. The next design thinking exercise that I asked my participants to engage in was a mapping exercise, and this involved 2 volunteer advocates sketching out their ideal examination room for a DV-SART case. And although, of course, these designs are not the most polished or practical, they did really introduce some new ideas about how these spaces could be most conducive for the entire response team. Now I will summarize my main takeaways from the research findings on the impact of environment on sexual assault patients. And these takeaways fell into 4 main areas, which I will expand upon individually. And there will be a few slides with quotes that I will sort of skim through for the sake of time, but feel free to pause and read them at your own pace. So the first takeaway is that members of the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Response Team at large described the environment of the emergency department as chaotic, overstimulating, and disorienting, which is not conducive to trauma. And here we have a quote from an advocate expanding on this, as well as a very interesting quote from a hospital designer who discusses how, in the eyes of an architect, the emergency room is really all about getting patients in and out as quickly as possible, and therefore has not been designed with comfort and healing in mind quite as much as inpatient or intensive care units. The next takeaway is that the placement of sexual assault patients within the emergency room is unpredictable. The next takeaway is that a standard emergency department examination room cannot accommodate for the people and procedures involved in a DV-SART case. And the design elements of these rooms include the size of the examination room, as well as the lighting, the seating, and the doors. And here we have quotes from two advocates, one who is commenting on how a bigger room is more trauma-informed because it allows patients room to breathe. And the second quote I find really compelling, and this advocate speaks to how if there's a lack of seating available in the room, it typically results in a gendered dynamic between police, who tend to stand, and the nurses, advocates, and patients who normally sit. And the police are then standing above with weapons visible, looking down onto a patient who has just experienced trauma. I thought this quote really highlighted an interesting situation in which a simple design intervention like adding more seating to an examination room could help in neutralizing this power dynamic between police and advocates and patients. And the final takeaway is regarding a secondary room to the medical examination room, which would increase the comfort for patients and the efficiency for nurses and advocates. And here's a quote from one nurse and her vision of a room that is not purely medical, but more of a multidisciplinary room that can be used as a waiting room for family members, or a room for the police interview, or a room for storage. And her main point is that all of the equipment and the materials needed for sexual assault nurse examiners could all be kept in one place. From the onset of this project, I knew that my final goal was to create a set of design recommendations for sexual assault patients and the hospital spaces that they occupy. And I hoped that these recommendations could be used by hospital staffs as well as healthcare architects and planners, and generally any organization that wants to make their spaces more trauma-informed. And briefly, I just want to take it back to one of my earlier slides. And with all of these design interventions and design goals, my hope is that each of them would aid in creating a structure and physical environment of safety, empowerment, and healing. So the first design goal is titled A Room of Their Own, and this largely encourages hospitals to designate one singular room for domestic violence and sexual assault cases, and to keep this room available for these patients when needed, which would provide a more streamlined environment for sexual assault nurse examiners and ensure that sexual assault patients had a comfortable room with all of the materials necessary when they arrive at the hospital. The next design goal is safety and security, and some interventions that would aid in achieving this goal are to provide a separate entrance for domestic violence and sexual assault patients to the emergency room that would not require them to walk through the chaos of the waiting room, as well as to provide examination room doors that are glass or transparent and allow patients to see out into the hallway and to know who will enter their room when they hear a knock. And finally, to ensure that there is clear signage throughout the emergency room as to not disorient patients to their surroundings. The next goal is patient choice, and this goes back to wanting to empower those who've undergone trauma with choice within their procedures and within the process that they undergo in the hospital. And this can come in small changes, such as offering a dimmer switch lighting in examination rooms, as well as providing control of the shades or curtains to windows to the patient, and giving the patient an accessible bathroom within their room so that they have full autonomy and privacy if they want it. The next design goal is to increase comfort and de-escalate stress, which is particularly important when the patients have undergone a recent trauma. And some simple interventions that could achieve this goal are to provide compact and convenient seating options, which the previous quote highlighted the importance of, and to use comfortable material on the hospital beds so that patients can not be on stiff plastic beds throughout their evidence collection exam. And lastly, the hospital should ensure that if a patient needs to have a public exam, that there is the appropriate equipment to do so. And my final design goal is organization and efficiency. And this essentially advocates for hospitals to install the appropriate storage for both patients' personal belongings as well as for the materials that sexual assault nurse examiners need for their everyday work, and to create an examination room layout that keeps the procedure of a sexual assault nurse examiner in mind to maximize their efficiency. To wrap up, I have a few closing thoughts as I conclude the project in this presentation. So, as I previously stated, the exact interventions within a hospital will vary depending on that hospital's parameters and budget and layout. However, I hope that these design goals that I have recommended are general enough that they can be implemented in a variety of ways that will adjust to cost, formality, and permanence. So, for example, if the lighting within a hospital room cannot be rewired, maybe adding a lamp would be a lower cost solution. And the most important design recommendation that I have is for hospital and healthcare architects and designers to collaborate with the people whose lives will be affected by your design decisions. And it is my belief that the nurses, physicians, advocates, and patients themselves absolutely have the most important insights into how the space that they will use should function and appear. So I would like to finally do some acknowledgments. First, to all of my participants, thank you for offering me your time and your insights. I think that the work all of you do is incredible, and especially to the nurses that are now serving at the front lines of this pandemic, thank you for the work you do, and thank you for giving me your time. Next, I would like to thank the entire Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department for teaching me so much the last 4 years, and especially to my two readers, Professor Baumgardner and Professor Brown, and to my wonderful advisor, Jamie Ake, who has seen me through this entire project and given me extremely valuable advice and feedback and the support needed to make this project happen. Thank you for your guidance. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions about this project or would like to discuss it more, I will leave my contact information in the description. I hope that you learned something new and you found this interesting, and again, thank you for your time.